When the blood of those who should have protected me stained my own hands, I understood that life isn't the beautiful romance they tell us about, but a succession of brutal moments that test how much we can endure before breaking or transforming into something we never imagined becoming. Before starting this story, I've carried in silence for decades. I want to ask you watching now, please subscribe to the channel, leave your like on this video, and comment which city you're watching from. Each of your comments is like a warm embrace for this old woman who needs more than ever to share what she's kept hidden for so long. My name is Mary Jo Sanders, but everyone here in Prescott, this little piece of Arizona where the mountain cold makes you forget you're in the Southwest, knows me as Grandma Mary from the square. I'm 79 years old with a back curved by time, fingers knotted with arthritis, eyesight not as sharp as before, and a small craft shop that's become more of a meeting place for the town's ladies than an actual business. I was born in 1946 in a wooden shack covered with tin sheets in rural Arizona. So far from town it seemed like another world. A simple house, dirt floor, no running water, no electricity. But in my early years, it was still a home. We didn't have much, but we had each other. My father, Joseph, known to everyone as Joe the Tracker. My mother, Sarah, who everyone called Miss Sarah, and my 3 brothers. The oldest, Anthony, was 10 years older than me, and already seemed like a man when I was still a girl with braids. The other 2, Peter and John, were closer to my age. We were a family like so many others in that region, poor, hard-working, fighting day after day against drought, against hunger, against the forgetfulness of a country that barely knew we existed. My father was a simple man, couldn't read or write, but knew the land like nobody else. He knew exactly when to plant each seed, where to find water even in the driest times, how to cure a sick animal using only wild herbs. He was respected in the area for this wisdom that didn't come from books, but from life. He worked as a sharecropper on Colonel Harrison's ranch, one of the most powerful men in the region. In exchange for a piece of land to cultivate, he gave half of everything he harvested. It was a hard life, from sunrise to sunset. But my father never complained. "It's what we have, my daughter," he would say, when I, still a child, questioned why we had so little while the colonel had so much. Mom worked just as hard, maybe even harder. She woke before sunrise to light the wood stove, prepare coffee, cornbread, beans that would be our food during the day. Then she would go to the field to help my father, come back to prepare lunch, take care of the house, wash clothes in the stream, and still found time to teach us what she knew, counting to 100, recognizing letters, the names of plants that healed and those that killed. My younger brothers followed in father's footsteps, learning to work the land from an early age, helping in the fields as soon as they could carry a water bucket or scare birds away from the crops. Peter had my father's calm manner, always observing, speaking little, thinking much. John was more cheerful, liked to tell stories, to invent games even after a whole day of hard work. Anthony, the oldest, was different. He had inherited my father's height and physical strength, but not his gentleness. From early on, he showed a difficult temperament, explosive, unpredictable, with an anger that always seemed ready to overflow. Mom said he was born that way, with hot blood, and that it wasn't his fault. Dad tried to control him as best he could, but even he had a certain fear when Anthony went into his fits of rage. At 18, Anthony already had famous fights in the region. He'd come home with skinned knuckles, sometimes with a bruised face, but always with a strange smile that gave me chills. He started hanging around with a group of boys from the neighboring ranch, all with the same reputation as troublemakers. Mom cried in secret, worried about the path he was taking. Dad tried to talk to him, but Anthony would just listen in silence, eyes fixed on some distant point, as if he wasn't really there. It was during this time that I noticed the way he looked at the girls in the area. It wasn't the look of admiration that other boys had. It was something darker, more threatening. I remember once, at the community 4th of July celebration, when he was watching Mary Beth, Mr. Joaquin's daughter. There was something so intense, so disturbing in that look that made me stay by her side the whole night, making up excuses not to leave her alone. 2 weeks later, Mary Beth appeared injured, with a torn dress after returning from town. She never spoke about what happened, but stopped going to celebrations, stopped smiling, and months later, her family moved far away. I was 13 then, and although I didn't fully understand what was happening, I felt an instinctive fear of my own brother. I avoided being alone with him, always tried to be near Mom or my other brothers when he was around. There was something in his eyes when he looked at me that made me feel like a bird before a snake, paralyzed, terrified, sensing danger but unable to flee. My father noticed these changes at home, the growing tension, the silent fear that Mom and I shared. He began to keep Anthony busy with heavier work, farther from home, as if trying to keep him away from us. For a time, this seemed to work. Life followed its difficult but predictable course. The harvests, the droughts, the rare rains that brought hope, the community celebrations that brought a little joy amid the harshness of daily life. Until one morning in August 1962, everything changed. Dad woke up with a strong pain in his chest, could barely breathe. Mom laid him down in bed, sent Peter to fetch the healer from the neighboring community. But when he arrived, it was already too late. My father, that strong man who seemed capable of enduring anything, had departed without even saying goodbye. My dear viewers who are following me this far, you can't imagine the pain of losing someone like that, suddenly, without warning. Especially when that person is the pillar of the house, the protector, the one who kept everything and everyone in balance. If you've ever lost someone important in your life, leave in the comments which city you're watching from. Your support at this moment, as I relive these painful memories, means so much to this old woman. The wake was organized in our own house, as was customary. The neighbors helped prepare the body, build the simple wooden coffin, arrange the living room to receive the people who would come to pay their last respects. They placed the coffin on 2 chairs in the middle of the room, lit candles at the 4 corners, and the house soon filled with people, distant relatives, neighbors, acquaintances from the ranch and nearby communities. Mom was devastated, but maintained the dignity she always had. Dressed in black, sitting beside the coffin, she received condolences with a nod of her head, her eyes red but dry, as if she had no more tears to shed. I stayed beside her, holding her hand, feeling that somehow the roles had reversed. Now I was the one who needed to protect her. My younger brothers, Peter and John, were lost, confused by this situation they couldn't fully comprehend. Anthony, on the other hand, seemed strange. He showed no sadness, didn't cry like the others. He stayed in a corner of the room, observing everything with a distant look, drinking moonshine that someone had brought to warm the body during the vigil, as they said. The night was long. People told stories about my father, prayed, sang old hymns that spoke of passage to the other world. The younger children eventually fell asleep in corners. The older ones took turns in the vigil. Around midnight, many people had already left, promising to return in the morning for the burial. Only a few closer relatives remained, dozing in chairs against the walls. That's when I noticed Anthony talking with his 2 inseparable friends, Damien and Tim, boys from the neighboring ranch who had the same reputation as troublemakers as he did. The 3 were drinking and talking in low voices, looking occasionally to where Mom and I were sitting. There was something in those looks that left me uneasy, with a chill in my stomach that wasn't just from grief. Around 2 in the morning, Anthony approached Mom. "Mother, you need to rest a bit," he said, with a gentleness that wasn't common for him. "Go lie down in the bedroom for a while. I'll stay here keeping vigil for Father." Mom, exhausted from suffering and hours of vigil, hesitated for a moment, but finally agreed. She looked at me. "Go with your mother, girl," ordered Anthony before she could speak. "She shouldn't be alone at a time like this." I accompanied Mom to the bedroom, feeling the eyes of Anthony and his friends following us. That chill in my stomach increased, but I couldn't understand why. He was my brother after all. As difficult as his temperament was, as much as I feared him sometimes, he was blood of my blood. What could happen? The bedroom was small, with just a double bed where my parents slept. There wasn't much space, but I lay down beside Mom, who seemed to have aged 10 years in a single day. She held my hand as she did when I was little and afraid of storms. "It will pass, my daughter," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "Everything in this life passes." I don't know how much time passed before the bedroom door opened. Perhaps I had dozed off, exhausted by the emotional day. The weak light of a lantern illuminated the room, and I saw Anthony standing in the doorway with his 2 friends right behind him. There was something in his eyes that I had never seen before, a gleam that wasn't of sadness nor anger, but something more primitive, more frightening. "What is it, Anthony?" asked Mom, sitting up in bed. "Nothing, Mother," he answered, entering the room and closing the door behind him. Damien and Tim came in right after, blocking the exit. "We just came to see if you're all right." It was at that moment that I understood something terrible was about to happen. The look they exchanged, the way they positioned themselves in the room, the way Anthony smiled. A smile I will never forget as long as I live. "Now I'm the man of the house," he said, taking a step in our direction. "And there are some things that need to change around here." My mother stood up, placing herself between me and them. Even in her moment of greatest fragility, her protective instinct spoke louder. "What do you think you're doing, Anthony?" she asked, her voice firm despite the fear she must have been feeling. "Your father hasn't even gone cold in his coffin, and you already—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The slap Anthony delivered was so strong, it made her fall back onto the bed, beside me. I screamed, trying to get up to help her, but Damien was already on top of me, holding my arms firmly, while Tim held my mother's legs. "Now you're going to learn who's in charge here," said Anthony, and there was a sick satisfaction in his voice that chilled me to the bone. What happened in that room, on that night when we should have been keeping vigil for my father, is something I've never been able to tell anyone. How do you put into words the violence, the humiliation, the physical and emotional pain we suffered at the hands of those who should have protected us? How do you describe the sound of my mother's muffled sobs, trying not to scream, to avoid waking my younger brothers in the room next door? How do you talk about my own screams, silenced by Damien's dirty hand over my mouth? Hours that seemed like an eternity. A nightmare from which we couldn't wake up. And when it finally ended, when they left the room laughing and whispering among themselves, we stayed there, Mom and I, embracing, trembling, crying in silence, unable to look at each other, to talk about what had happened. "They'll be back," whispered Mom after a long time, her voice so low I could barely hear. This was just the beginning, and she was right. That night was just the start of our private hell. A hell that would last for years, that would forever change who we were, that would force us to make decisions we never imagined being capable of making. But that night, lying in that bed, smelling the sweat and moonshine they had left in the air, hearing my mother's restrained sobs, I made a silent promise, a promise I would keep secret for years, but that I never forgot. They would pay for what they did. One way or another, someday, they would pay. The morning came with a particular cruelty that day. The sun entered through the cracks in the wooden window as if nothing had happened, as if the world continued the same. But nothing was the same. Everything had changed that night in a way that neither I nor my mother could yet fully comprehend. We got up in silence, avoiding looking at each other. It hurt to move. It hurt to breathe. It hurt to exist. But we had a funeral to face, appearances to keep, a final goodbye to give to the man who, without knowing it, had been our only protection against the evil that lived under the same roof. People began arriving early to accompany the procession to the small community cemetery. Anthony and his friends acted as if nothing had happened. My brother even cried in front of everyone when they closed the coffin, fake tears that gave me more disgust than sadness. The burial was like so many others in that region, simple, quick, under the strong sun that punished backs already punished by work. People threw flowers on the coffin, prayed, hugged us, offering words of comfort that couldn't reach us. We were beyond comfort, beyond words, beyond the understanding of those who hadn't gone through what we had. We returned home in silence, a home that was no longer a home, but a prison where our jailers were our own blood, a home where the nightmare hadn't ended with the dawn, but had only begun, and would last much longer than we could bear. The days that followed my father's burial were like living in a slow-motion nightmare. The house where I grew up, which was already small and cramped, became a cage where my mother and I were cornered animals, always vigilant, always afraid. Anthony took my father's place in the fields, negotiating with Colonel Harrison to continue the work as a sharecropper. In front of others, he behaved like the responsible son who had taken on the family's support after his father's sudden death. But inside the house, He was a completely different person. The first weeks were the worst. He and his friends came home drunk almost every night. Mom tried to keep my younger brothers protected, sending them to sleep early at an aunt's house nearby, making up excuses about helping with work in the fields. But Peter, who was already 12, began to suspect something was wrong. He saw the bruises on my mother, noticed the way I would shrink when Anthony entered a room. "What's happening, Mary?" he asked me one afternoon while we were gathering firewood near the stream, far from anyone's ears. "Why is Mom always crying? Why haven't you smiled since Dad died?" I couldn't answer. How do you explain to a child the horror we were living? How do you put the unimaginable into words? I just hugged my brother, holding back the tears that threatened to fall, and whispered that everything would be all right, that it was just the sadness over our father's death, that it would soon pass. But it didn't pass. The situation only got worse with time. As my mother had predicted, that first night was just the beginning. Anthony seemed to take pleasure in humiliating us, in subjecting us to his will, in constantly reminding us that now he was in charge. Damien and Tim were constant presences, participating in the cruelty, turning our suffering into some kind of sick entertainment. The worst of all was the shame. The shame that prevented us from asking for help, from telling anyone what was happening inside the four walls of that house. In the countryside, in rural communities like ours, at that time, there were things that simply weren't talked about, secrets that were kept buried for generations. "If anyone finds out, Mary, they'll blame us," my mother would say. When, desperate, I suggested running away, asking for help from the police, the pastor, some neighbor. "They'll say we provoked it, that it's our fault. That's how things work." And she was right. I was old enough to understand how the world treated women like us. I had seen how they looked at Mary Beth after what happened to her, how they whispered that she must have provoked it, that a proper girl doesn't walk alone. I had heard stories of other women who tried to report abuse and ended up being even more mistreated, sometimes even expelled from their communities. So we were silent. We endured. We survived day after day, night after night, like someone weathering an endless storm, waiting for it to pass at some point, even without really believing it would happen. My younger brothers, Peter and John, perceived that something was wrong, but didn't understand what. They were spared the worst, as Anthony and his friends waited until they were away or asleep. Even so, they were growing up in an environment of constant tension, seeing their mother and sister physically and emotionally wasting away, witnessing fights and violence that, even without fully understanding, were shaping their view of the world and of themselves. Mom tried to protect them as best she could. In the rare moments when Anthony went out to work without his cronies, we managed to breathe a little, recover a fragment of normalcy. In these moments, she taught the boys what she could, to read, to count, to respect women, to be different from their older brother. "You are like your father," she would tell them. "You have his heart, his kindness. Never forget that." For me, she reserved different conversations, always in whispers, always when we were sure we were alone. "One day this will end, my daughter," she promised, holding my hands between hers. "One day we will find a way to leave here, to start over somewhere else. But until then, we have to be strong. We have to survive." It was this promise that kept me alive in the darkest days, the hope that someday we would find a way out, that there would be a life beyond that hell, a future where we could breathe without fear, sleep without terror, live without the constant threat hanging over our heads. My dear viewers, I know this story is difficult to hear. Sometimes, when I tell it, I see in the eyes of those listening that gleam of disbelief, as if they're thinking, "This can't be true. Things like this don't happen." But they do happen. They happened to me, to my mother, and they still happen today to so many women and girls across this country. If you're listening to this and you identify with it, know that you're not alone. Leave in the comments which city you're watching from. Your testimony, even anonymous, can give strength to someone else who's going through the same thing. The situation lasted for almost 2 years. 2 years that seemed like an eternity, where each day was a battle to maintain sanity, to not completely succumb to despair. I was 16 when things began to change, not because Anthony or his friends had become less cruel, but because something inside me and my mother began to transform. It was after a particularly brutal night, when Tim and Damien had drunk more than usual, and Anthony was in one of his worst moods. They had already gone, leaving us broken as they always did. Mom and I were sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, without the strength to light the lantern, without the desire to see each other's new bruises. "I can't take it anymore," I whispered, surprised by my own voice after hours of silence. "I'd rather die than continue like this." I expected her to say what she always said, that we had to be strong, that one day we would find a way out, that for now we needed to survive. But this time, it was different. "I can't take it anymore either, my daughter," she answered, and there was a new resolution in her voice, something I hadn't heard since my father was alive. "And we won't die. They will." I looked at her, trying to make out her face in the dimness. I couldn't believe what I had heard. My mother, always so resigned, always so accepting of the fate that had been imposed on us, was suggesting something that had never crossed my mind. "How?" I asked, my voice just a breath. "I don't know yet," she answered. "But we'll find a way. They won't continue doing this to us. They won't continue doing this to my children." That night, something changed between us. We were no longer just victims, waiting for the horror to end on its own. We were determined to do something, to take control of our lives back, even if it meant crossing boundaries we never thought we'd cross. In the days that followed, we observed. We paid attention to schedules, to habits, to moments of vulnerability. Anthony and his friends were strong, violent, merciless, but they had weaknesses. Drink made them careless. Arrogance made them underestimate two women they considered completely subjugated. We began to plan in secret, in the rare moments when we could talk without being overheard. It was a simple plan, born of desperation and the determination of those who had nothing left to lose. "We can't tell Peter and John," said my mother. "They're too young to carry this burden." I agreed. My brothers were suffering enough just witnessing the situation, without fully understanding what was happening. We couldn't involve them further. We couldn't make them accomplices to what we were planning. The plan took shape gradually, each detail carefully thought out during long, sleepless nights, in moments stolen between household chores. It was risky. It was dangerous. It was our only hope. The opportunity came on a community celebration night. It was the 4th of July, and everyone was gathered around the bonfire, eating, drinking, dancing, celebrating as if there was no tomorrow. Anthony, as always, was with Damien and Tim, the three already intoxicated by moonshine since early on. "Today," whispered my mother when they left for the celebration, leaving us at home with the order to have hot food waiting when they returned. "It has to be today." We sent Peter and John to their aunt's house, with the excuse that they also deserved to participate a little in the celebration. In truth, we wanted them far from what was about to happen. We prepared everything as agreed. The food they demanded: beans, rice, a meat stew we had saved for special occasions, the table set as they liked it, the moonshine bottles in sight, ready to continue the drinking they had already started at the celebration. And most importantly, the Jimson weed, ground and discreetly mixed into the stew, an amount small enough not to be noticed in the taste, large enough to do what needed to be done. Jimson weed was something all women in the region knew and feared. If not prepared correctly, it releases a powerful poison. My mother knew exactly how much to use, how to use it. She had learned from her own mother, who had learned from her mother before her. "It's women's knowledge," she explained to me as we prepared, "passed down from generation to generation for moments like this." As we waited, fear and determination fought within me. What we were about to do was irreversible. It was criminal. It was also, at that moment, the only way we saw to escape the hell we were living in. They arrived after midnight, drunk as we expected, noisy, demanding food, imposing their presence as they always did. They sat at the table, served themselves generously from the stew, praised the flavor between sips of moonshine and crude jokes. Mom and I watched from a distance, in silence, waiting. We felt no guilt, no hesitation, just a strange detachment, as if we were watching a scene that didn't concern us. The first symptoms appeared quickly: excessive sweating, nausea, disorientation. They didn't understand what was happening, believed it was just the excess of drink. When they realized something was wrong, it was already too late. We watched impassively as they writhed, screamed, begged for help. We didn't move a finger. At that moment, we were no longer the loving mother and the obedient daughter. We were avengers, executioners of a sentence they themselves had signed with their acts. When they finally became motionless, when the last breath left their bodies, we looked at each other. There was no need for words. What had to be done was done. What would come after, we would face together. We cleaned everything. The table, the dishes, the entire kitchen. We dragged the bodies out of the house to a more remote area where the soil was softer. We dug for hours under the weak light of the moon, our hands bleeding with the effort, our bodies exhausted, but our minds strangely calm. We buried them deep, side by side, in an unmarked grave, without ornaments, without prayers. There was no place for them in heaven, no place for them in our future memories. Only in the silence of the earth that now covered them. We returned home before dawn, cleaned ourselves, burned the dirty clothes, scattered the ashes around the yard. When my brothers returned the next morning, they found the house clean and quiet, as if nothing had happened. "Where's Anthony?" asked Peter, noticing the absence of the older brother. "He went to the city with his friends," answered my mother without hesitating. "Said he got a better job there." Nobody questioned it. It was common for young men from the countryside to leave to try their luck in the big cities. Many never returned, either because they had found a better life or because they had found only more misery. In the beginning, there were still sporadic questions. Some neighbor who was surprised not to have seen the three young men, someone who asked if they had sent news. With time, the questions ceased. People disappeared in the desert all the time, swallowed by drought, by poverty, by distance. Mom and I never talked about what happened that night. There was no need. It was a secret we carried together, a burden we shared, an invisible line we crossed with no possibility of return. Life continued. Different, but it continued. We took over the work in the fields, me and Mom along with my brothers who were already growing up. It was hard, but it was honest. The absence of Anthony and his friends was like removing a crushing weight from our shoulders. We began to breathe again, to sleep without fear, to exist without the constant shadow of terror. The physical scars healed with time. The others, the invisible ones, those never completely disappeared. They were there, under the surface, reminding us of the price we paid for our freedom, the boundary we crossed to survive. They were difficult years, but of a different difficulty. The struggle against poverty, against drought, against forgetfulness. This was familiar. It was what we had always known. It was no longer the struggle against the monster inside the house, against the terror of endless nights, against the humiliation that corroded our soul. Little by little, we rebuilt what Anthony had destroyed. Trust, security, the ability to look to the future and see something beyond fear. It wasn't easy, it wasn't quick, but it happened. We were survivors in more than one sense, stronger than we ever imagined being. And behind it all, always present but never mentioned, was that secret. That night, that unmarked grave in the red earth of the desert, the price we paid for our liberation. 5 years passed since that night. 5 years of a heavy silence that Mom and I carried like a secret pact. Nobody ever discovered what happened to Anthony, Damien, and Tim. Some people in the community came to comment that they had heard they were working in California. Others said they had gone to the gold mines in Alaska. Stories that we discreetly fed, without confirming or denying, letting them take on a life of their own and replace the truth that only the two of us knew. In those 5 years, many things changed. Peter, who was 12 when it all happened, was now 17, almost a grown man, strong and determined like our father. John, at 15, was more of a dreamer, talked about studying, about leaving the farm one day, about knowing the world beyond those hills. They grew up without Anthony's shadow, without the poison of his hatred and violence contaminating their young souls, and that was a silent victory that Mom and I celebrated each day. We worked hard on the farm, the 4 of us together. It wasn't easy. The life of a Southwesterner never was. But there was a peace we hadn't known before. At night, sitting around the simple wooden table my father had made years before, we would talk, sometimes laugh, share the little we had with a gratitude that only those who have been at the bottom of the pit can feel. I was 21 then, and, even young, I already carried more painful experiences than many people accumulate in a lifetime. The nightmares still came, less frequent with the passing of time, but still vivid, still capable of making me wake up in a cold sweat, choking back a scream so as not to alarm the rest of the house. Mom had hers too, I knew. Sometimes I would find her sitting alone in the kitchen in the middle of the night, looking at nothing, her trembling hands holding a cup of tea, long gone cold. We never talked about those times, about what we had gone through, about what we had done. It was as if we had made a tacit agreement to bury those memories along with the bodies of those who had made us suffer so much. But even buried, they were there, like deep roots of a poisonous tree, invisible on the surface but still alive, still influencing everything around them. It was on the 7th anniversary of my father's death, and consequently, close to the date of what we had done, that things began to change again. We were all in the living room after dinner when we heard strong knocks on the door. It wasn't common to receive visitors at that hour, much less in that way, and I immediately felt a chill in my stomach, a premonition that something wasn't right. Peter, already assuming the role of the man of the house, went to answer. It was the oldest son of Mr. Manuel, our closest neighbor, breathless and agitated. "There are people asking about Anthony at Joe's store," he said, without even properly entering. "Two men nobody knows around here, relatives of Damien and Tim, from what I understood." I felt the blood freeze in my veins. In 5 years, we had never faced a situation like this. I looked at my mother, who had visibly paled, but maintained her composure in front of the boys. "They must be their cousins," she said, with a calmness I knew was only surface deep. "Anthony wrote last year saying he was working with them in California. Tomorrow I'll go to the store to talk to these men." Peter and John seemed to accept the explanation, but I knew my mother too well not to notice the terror hidden behind her eyes. As soon as the boys went to sleep, we met in the kitchen, speaking in whispers despite the silent house. "They came looking, Mom," I said, my voice trembling. "After so long." "It was to be expected," she answered, surprising me with her lucidity. "Sooner or later someone would wonder, someone would want to know. Especially Damien's family, who were closer." "And now?" I asked, feeling the panic grow. "If they discover, if they know what we did?" "They won't discover," she cut in, her voice firm. "They have no way to prove anything. What we did is well buried, you know that." But I wasn't so sure. I looked through the small kitchen window, to the darkness outside, to that distant piece of land where years before we had buried our secret along with our torturers. What if someone had seen? What if someone knew? What if these men weren't just concerned relatives, but people who already suspected something? "We need to prepare for the worst," I finally said, turning back to look at my mother. "If they discover, if they come after us." I didn't need to finish the sentence. Mom understood perfectly what I wanted to say. We had crossed a line years ago, a line that most people never imagine crossing. And if necessary, we would cross it again. "Tomorrow I'll go to the store," she decided. "I'll talk to these men, find out what they really want. Meanwhile, you stay home with the boys. If I don't come back by noon?" "Don't even think about that," I interrupted, horrified at the possibility. "We'll go together. We've always faced everything together." She hesitated, then agreed with a nod. We spent the rest of the night planning, thinking of all the possibilities, all the scenarios. If they were just concerned relatives, we would maintain the story we had created. Anthony, Damien, and Tim had gone to California, then to Alaska. They sent news rarely. The last letter had been more than a year ago. But if they suspected something, if they asked too much, if they tried to intimidate us, well, we weren't the same fragile and frightened women from years ago. We had hardened. We had learned that sometimes the only way out is to create your own door, even if it means tearing down walls that most people would never dare to touch. My dear viewers who are following me, have you ever felt that deep fear, that dread that reaches to your bones when you realize a terrible secret might be discovered? It's like standing on the edge of an abyss, feeling the ground crumbling beneath your feet, knowing that at any moment you might fall into the void. If you've ever felt something similar, comment which city you're watching from. It's comforting to know I'm not alone in these heavy memories. The next morning, we put on our best clothes, which were still very simple, and went to Joe's store. We walked in silence, each lost in her own thoughts, preparing for what was to come. The store was about a 40-minute walk from our house, on the edge of the dirt road that led to town. When we arrived, I immediately saw who must be these men. They were sitting on a bench outside the store, drinking whiskey despite the hour, looking around with that suspicion typical of those who aren't from the area. One was older, must have been about 50, gray hair, face marked by the sun and time. The other was younger, maybe 30, and there was something in his look that immediately reminded me of Damien. The same malicious gleam, the same poorly disguised arrogance. I swallowed the fear that rose in my throat and followed my mother, who walked determinedly toward them. Joe, the store owner, saw us coming and made a discreet gesture with his head, indicating the men, confirming they were the ones who had been asking about Anthony. "Good morning," my mother greeted, her voice surprisingly firm. "I heard you're looking for my son Anthony." The men looked us up and down, evaluating us with a curiosity that left me uneasy. The older man stood up, extending his hand to my mother. "Jerome Smith," he introduced himself, "uncle of Damien, and this is my son, Jesse." Mom shook his hand briefly, then crossed her arms over her chest, a defensive posture that didn't go unnoticed. "Sarah Sanders," she said, "and this is my daughter, Mary." "Your son left with my nephew and Tim how long ago?" asked Jerome, his eyes fixed on my mother's face, looking for any sign of nervousness or deception. "Going on 6 years this December," Mom answered without hesitation, sticking to the story we had rehearsed. "They went to California, then to Alaska for gold mining. They sent news a few times. The last was—" "When, Mary?" "Last year," I replied, joining the charade. "A short letter just saying they were doing well, that they'd found work on a large ranch out there." Jerome and Jesse exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. There was suspicion there, but also something else, something that put me even more on alert. "Strange," said Jesse, speaking for the first time, "because we also received a letter from Damien last year. He said he was coming to visit family, that he was homesick and wanted to see everyone. The letter arrived in May. We waited and waited, but he never showed up. I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. A letter? How could there be a letter if Damien was dead, buried in a forgotten corner of our property for 5 years? I quickly glanced at my mother, who maintained her composure, but I noticed a small muscle twitch in her face, a tiny sign of tension that only I, who knew her so well, could notice. "That is very strange," she said, her voice still calm, but with a note of concern that wasn't there before. "The letter we received didn't mention anything about coming back. Perhaps they changed their minds at the last moment? Or maybe—" She didn't finish the sentence, leaving in the air the suggestion that something might have happened to them on the way. It was a risky move, but necessary given this unexpected revelation. "Or maybe," said Jerome, taking a step toward us, "someone is lying about where they are." There was a moment of tension so palpable it felt like we could cut it with a knife. Jerome's eyes, hard and suspicious, fixed on my mother's. Jesse slowly standing up, his hand casually resting near his waist, where I could see the handle of a knife. My mother, still as a statue, her face a mask of offended dignity. And me, feeling my heart beat so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Smith?" asked Mom, her voice now with a hardness that matched the man in front of her. He didn't answer immediately. He studied us for a few more seconds, as if trying to read the truth in our faces, in our posture, in our poorly disguised fear. "Nothing," he finally said, stepping back. "I'm not suggesting anything. We're just worried about our boy, as you must understand." My mother nodded, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Of course I understand. I'm worried about Anthony, too. It's been a long time since we've had news. If you hear anything, please let us know." "Certainly," replied Jerome, but there was a tone in his voice that didn't match his words. "And you do the same, if you have news." We agreed, exchanged a few words of farewell, and walked away. We walked in silence until we were far enough from the store, out of earshot of Jerome and Jesse. Only then did Mom stop, leaning against a tree by the side of the road, her face finally showing the terror she had hidden so well. "The letter," I whispered, still unable to believe it. How can there be a letter? Someone wrote it for them, she answered, her voice low, looking around to make sure we were really alone. Or they're lying, trying to catch us in a contradiction. Both possibilities were terrifying. If someone had written the letter, it meant they knew what had happened and were playing a cruel game with us. If they were lying to test us, it meant they already suspected something and were just looking for confirmation. They'll be back, I said, feeling the same fear I had felt years ago when Anthony and his friends entered the bedroom during my father's wake. They won't give up so easily. No, they won't, agreed Mom, straightening up, determination returning to her face. But neither will we. We returned home in silence, each step taking us deeper into dark thoughts, into plans we never imagined we would have to make. The feeling was of reliving a nightmare, of returning to those days of constant terror, of paralyzing fear. But there was a crucial difference. We were no longer defenseless victims. We had proven to ourselves, in the most brutal way possible, that we were capable of fighting, of surviving, of doing the unthinkable when necessary. At home, we told an edited version to Peter and John, that relatives of Damien and Tim were looking for news, that they were worried that they might come visit us to learn more. We didn't mention the letter. We didn't mention the veiled accusations. We didn't show the fear we felt. That night, after everyone went to sleep, Mom and I met again in the kitchen. The plan we developed was simple and terrible at the same time. If Jerome and Jesse came back, if they threatened us, if they tried to expose what they suspected, well, the Arizona desert was a place where people disappeared all the time. 2 more wouldn't make a difference. It's horrible to think this way, I whispered, feeling the weight of the decision we were making. That would be 2 more lives. It's not what we want, replied Mom, holding my hands in hers. It's what might be necessary. To protect ourselves, to protect your brothers, to protect the future we managed to build after so much suffering. I knew she was right. We hadn't chosen this path. It had been imposed on us by Anthony's cruelty and his friends, by the society that closed its eyes to the suffering of women like us, by the system that left us completely helpless. We had done what needed to be done to survive, and if necessary, we would do it again. During the days that followed, we lived in a constant state of alert. Every sound in the night made us jump out of bed. Every stranger on the road made us panic. Every look from the neighbors seemed charged with unspoken suspicions. We kept knives hidden in various places in the house, continued to plan, to prepare for the worst. But Jerome and Jesse didn't return, not immediately. Perhaps they were letting time pass, believing that would make us more relaxed, less vigilant. Maybe they were gathering more evidence, more information. Maybe they were just waiting for the perfect moment to confront us. We were prepared for men, for accusations, for fight against those who wanted to expose our terrible secret. What we were not prepared for, what we could never have predicted, was the way our past would come back to haunt us, not through strangers thirsty for revenge, but through the most unlikely and devastating means possible. It was on a Saturday afternoon, almost a month after the encounter at the store, that everything came to light. We were all at home, Mom preparing dinner, me helping with the vegetables, Peter fixing a broken tool, John reading a book borrowed from the teacher's son. A scene of domestic normalcy that had become precious to us after so many years of terror. The sun was beginning to set when we heard knocks on the door. Not strong and aggressive knocks like we had imagined in our nightmares, but soft, almost hesitant. Still, we exchanged an alarmed look, Mom and I. I discreetly grabbed the knife I was using to cut vegetables, hiding it in the folds of my skirt. It was Peter who answered, as always. We heard his exclamation of surprise, then his animated voice calling for Mom. Perplexed, we went to the door. And there, standing on the threshold, thin and worn, but unmistakably alive, was Tim. The shock paralyzed my entire body. There, before us, was Tim, thinner, older, with visible scars on his face, but undeniably alive. How was it possible? I had seen his lifeless body, had helped drag him to the grave, had thrown dirt over him. I felt the world spin around me. The walls of the house seemed to close in on me. Peter was excited, hugging the one he considered an older friend who had returned after so many years. John, who barely remembered him, kept his distance, observing with curiosity. Mom was even paler than I must have been, but maintained her composure with a strength I never understood where it came from. "Tim!" she exclaimed, with a naturalness that amazed me. "After so long. Come in, come in." He entered limping, leaning on an improvised cane. When he passed by me, his eyes met mine for a moment. There was no hatred in them, as I would have expected. There was no accusation. There was something different, something I couldn't immediately identify. "Where are Anthony and Damien?" asked Peter, while helping him sit at the table. "Did they come with you?" Tim hesitated, looking quickly at me and Mom before answering. "No, they didn't come," he said finally. "It's a long story. We're all eager to hear it," said Mom, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. "But first, rest a bit." The journey must have been long. While Peter and John bombarded Tim with questions about the big city, about the adventures he had lived, about what he had seen in all these years, Mom and I exchanged tense looks. How had he survived? How had he come back? And more importantly, what would he tell the boys? When night fell and dinner was served, I felt like I was living a nightmare while awake. We ate in silence, interrupted only by the occasional questions from the boys and Tim's brief answers. He ate slowly, as if each movement was painful. "The boys need to sleep," Mom finally said when the meal was over. "Tomorrow you can talk more." Peter and John protested, but she was firm. Reluctantly, they went to the bedroom, leaving us three alone in the kitchen. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with unasked questions, with unspoken accusations, with a fear so dense it seemed to make breathing difficult. "How did you—" I began, unable to complete the question. "Survive," he completed, his voice hoarse. "By a hair, the Jimson weed. I must have eaten less than the others. Or maybe my body reacted differently. I got very, very sick. I thought I was going to die. I think you thought so too." "We saw you stop breathing," said Mom, her voice low, controlled. "We saw your eyes, empty." "I almost died," he confirmed. "But when you buried me, there was still a thread of life in me. Weak, but it was there." I shuddered, imagining the horror. Him, partially conscious, being dragged, thrown into a grave, covered with dirt. "How did you manage to get out?" I asked, unable to imagine how someone in the state we saw him would be strong enough to dig his way out of a grave. "Someone saved me," he said, looking at his own hands. "A hunter passing by with his dogs. The dogs sensed something, started digging. He found me still alive, though barely." Mom and I exchanged frightened looks. Someone knew. Someone had witnessed our crime. "Who?" asked Mom, her voice trembling for the first time that night. "Who saved you?" "A man who wasn't from around here. He was just passing through. Had his own past to hide, from what I gathered. Didn't ask questions, didn't tell anyone. He took me far away, cared for me until I recovered enough." "And Anthony? Damien?" I asked, even already knowing the answer. "Dead," he answered simply. "The poison worked perfectly on them. When the hunter found me, it was already too late for them." Another heavy silence settled between us. The question hammering in my mind finally escaped my lips. "Why did you come back?" He looked at me for a long time before answering. "Not for revenge, if that's what you're thinking," he said finally, although I thought about it for a long time. In the beginning, when I was recovering, hate was the only thing keeping me alive. I planned to come back, tell everyone what you had done, see you in jail or worse. I felt my heart race. So that was it. He had come back to expose us, to denounce us, to destroy the life we had rebuilt with so much effort. "Then why haven't you done that yet?" asked Mom, her voice now firm. "Why this conversation? Why didn't you go straight to the police?" "Because I understood," he answered simply. "With time, when the anger subsided, when I could think clearly again, I understood what we had done to you, what I had done, what Anthony and Damien had done." His words caught me by surprise. Of all the things I expected to hear, this confession wasn't one of them. "I saw other women suffering the same," he continued. "In the city, in the places I passed through. Women abused, assaulted, treated as if they weren't people. And there were always men like us, like I was, laughing, drinking, treating everything like a big joke. Silent tears ran down my face. They weren't tears of fear, nor of regret, but of an emotion I couldn't name. Seeing that man, one of those who had caused so much suffering, speaking like this, recognizing what he had done, it was something I never thought would happen. I changed, he continued, or at least I'm trying to. I'm not the Tim anymore. Maybe I needed to almost die to understand what I was doing to others. I've spent the last few years trying to fix what I could, helping women escape situations like yours. It's not much, it's not enough, but it's something. My mother, who rarely showed emotion, was crying now. A silent, contained cry, but real. I came to ask forgiveness, he said, looking at each of us, not to receive it. I know what we did is unforgivable. I came so you would know that I understand why you did what you did, that I don't blame you, that if I were in your place, I would have done the same. My dear viewers, who are continuing with me on this painful journey, have you ever experienced a moment like this, where something you believed to be absolute, black and white, right and wrong, suddenly reveals itself to be much more complex, where the person you saw as a monster reveals himself to be human, with regrets, with the capacity for change? If you've ever lived through something similar, leave in the comments which city you're watching from. It's comforting to know I'm not alone in reliving these heavy memories. I'll leave tomorrow, Tim continued. I didn't plan to stay. I just wanted you to know that I'm alive, but that your secret is safe with me. Jerome and Jesse. They suspect, but they don't know. They have no proof, and they never will. How do you know about them? I asked, surprised that he knew about the uncle and cousin's visit. I have friends in the region, he answered vaguely. People who keep me informed. I knew they were looking. I knew they had come to you. That's why I decided to come now, so you would understand that you don't need to fear. Mom got up, took a bottle of whiskey we kept for medicine, and served a little for each of us. We drank in silence, absorbing the strangeness of that situation. We were three people united by a crime, by a secret, by a past we could never erase, but that had somehow transformed us. Where will you stay tonight? Mom finally asked. At old Manuel's house, Tim replied. He doesn't know anything. Thinks I'm just an acquaintance of yours who's passing through. I nodded, relieved that he wouldn't stay under our roof. Despite his words, despite believing in his repentance, I wouldn't be able to sleep knowing he was in the same house. When he got up to leave, Mom did something that surprised me. She briefly held his hand, a gesture that wasn't of affection nor forgiveness, but of recognition. A silent recognition of what had happened, of what we had all done, of what we could never change. What will you tell the boys? I asked, suddenly worried about the story he would tell my brothers. The truth, he answered, or part of it. That Anthony and Damien died in the city, of disease. That I've been living around, working where I can. Nothing about what happened that night. They don't need to know. I agreed, grateful that he understood my brothers needed to be spared this terrible story. They had grown up without Anthony's shadow, had built their own identities, their own values. Revealing the truth now would only bring unnecessary suffering. Tim kept his word. The next morning, he told the boys a sanitized version of his story. How he had gone to California with Anthony and Damien, how the two had gotten sick and died, how he had survived working in different places, learning different trades. Peter and John listened fascinated, asking questions, absorbing every detail of that story that, in their innocence, they believed to be completely true. When Tim left after lunch, promising to write, a promise that deep down we knew wouldn't be kept, I felt a strange weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't forgiveness. I could never completely forgive what he and the others had done to us, but it was something like peace. The peace of knowing our secret was safe, that we could continue living the life we had built with so much effort and sacrifice. That night, when everyone was already asleep, Mom and I met again in the kitchen, as we had so many times before. We sat in silence for a long time, each lost in her own thoughts. Do you think he really changed? I finally asked. I don't know, Mom answered honestly. Maybe. People can change when they face something that forces them to really look at themselves. Like we changed, I completed. She nodded. Like we changed. Because it was true, we weren't the same women as before. The violence we had suffered, The violence we had committed in response had transformed us, hardened us in some ways, made us more compassionate in others, more cautious, more aware of what human beings are capable of doing, both evil and good. In the days that followed, we anxiously waited for news that Jerome and Jessie had returned, that they were asking more questions, that they suspected something. But nothing happened. Whatever Tim had said or done seemed to have calmed them or driven them away. We never heard from them again. Life continued its course. Peter, at 19, began dating the teacher's daughter, a sweet and intelligent girl who seemed to light up the house when she came to visit. John, at 17, insisted more and more on his dream of studying, of going to the city, of finding a path different from working on the farm. Mom was slowly aging, but maintained the same strength, the same determination she had always had. And me? I was 23, an age when many girls in the area were already married, with children. But my experience had shaped me differently. I couldn't see myself in that traditional role, couldn't easily trust, especially men. The few suitors who appeared were gently pushed away, to the frustration of Mom, who dreamed of grandchildren. But in secret, in my heart, another dream was taking shape. A dream inspired, ironically, by Tim's words about helping other women. If he, who had been part of the problem, could change and try to do something positive, what could I do? I, who had lived in my own skin what so many other women suffered silently. It was during this period that I began to get closer to the women of the community. Not just the older ladies Mom had known for years, but the girls my age, the newlyweds, those who had just had children. I talked, listened, observed, and what I saw broke my heart. In many of them, I recognized the same look I saw in the mirror during those terrible years. The same disguised fear, the same shame, the same resignation in the face of the unbearable. "What are you doing with these women?" Mom asked one night, after I had spent the afternoon with Mary Beth, a 20-year-old young woman who everyone knew was beaten by her husband. "Talking," I answered simply. "Listening." She looked at me for a long time, as if she could see through me, read my thoughts, understand my plans before I fully comprehended them myself. "Be careful," she finally said. "This world doesn't like women who ask questions, who cause problems." "I know that," I replied. "But I also know that some questions need to be asked, that some problems need to be caused." She smiled then, a rare and genuine smile that lit up her tired face. "You are strong, my daughter. You always were. Stronger than me." "No, Mom," I disagreed, holding her calloused hands. "I'm strong because you taught me to be. Because I saw in you an example of how to survive the worst storms without losing dignity, without losing humanity." That night, something changed between us. The secret we shared, which had been a burden for so long, transformed into something different. No longer just a crime we had committed together, but a testimony to our resistance, our refusal to accept a fate that others had decided for us. It wasn't pride. We could never be proud of taking lives, even if they were the lives of those who hurt us so deeply. But it was a kind of acceptance, an understanding that our choices, however terrible they were, had been made in a context where all other doors were closed. In the weeks and months that followed, I began to act more deliberately. I taught women to read and write, in small meetings disguised as sewing or Bible study gatherings. I shared knowledge of herbs and remedies that Mom had taught me, including ways to avoid unwanted pregnancies, a powerful and forbidden knowledge that had been passed from woman to woman for generations. More importantly, I created a space where women could talk, could share their stories, could find comfort and strength in each other. A space where they weren't judged, weren't blamed for their own suffering, where they were seen as complete human beings with a right to dignity, respect, safety. It was dangerous work, work that challenged the deepest structures of that rural society, of that time. I received suspicious looks, veiled threats, malicious comments. That Mary, who never married, who puts ideas in women's heads, some said. But I continued, because I knew I was doing something important, something necessary. Peter and John supported me, each in their own way. Peter, now engaged, had become a different man than Anthony had been. Gentle, respectful, incapable of raising his hand to a woman. John, with his books and dreams, spoke of a world where things would be different, where women and men would be equal. I smiled, listening to him, thinking that perhaps, with young people like him, that world really might be possible one day. Mom observed everything with that mixture of concern and pride that only mothers can feel. Sometimes she helped me, offering her house for meetings, sharing her wisdom with the younger ones. Other times, she warned me of the dangers, of the limits I was testing. But she never stopped me, never asked me to stop. She understood, better than anyone, what motivated me. A year after Tim's visit, when the fear of being discovered had considerably diminished, we received news of him. Not directly, but through a traveler who passed through the region and brought a message. Tim had settled in West Texas, was working as a midwife, a traditionally female occupation, but one he had taken on after learning from an old woman of the desert. He was well, thought of us, hoped we were at peace. The news caught me by surprise, awakening contradictory emotions. I could never forget what he had done, the suffering he had caused. But I also couldn't deny that his words that night had planted a seed in me, had helped shape the work I now did. It was a strange, complex, disturbing connection in many ways, but real. "Our paths are strange, aren't they?" commented Mom when she heard the news. "We never know where they'll lead. We never know who will cross them." It was true. When I looked back, at the frightened girl I had been, at the desperate young woman who had helped commit a terrible crime, I could hardly believe the woman I had become. A woman who carried a heavy secret, a guilt that would never completely disappear, but also a mission, a purpose, a determination to use my own experience of pain to try to alleviate the pain of others. It wasn't redemption. Some things can't be redeemed. It was transformation. The transformation of a victim into a survivor, of a survivor into a fighter, of a fighter into an agent of change. A small, local, almost invisible change to the eyes of the world, but real and significant for those whose lives it touched. The reckoning we had served that distant night, with Jimson weed and determination born of desperation, hadn't been the end of the story, as I believed for so long. It had been just the beginning of a long and difficult path of healing, of learning, of growth that would continue for the rest of our lives. That night had taught me what women are capable of doing when pushed beyond the limits of the bearable. The nights that followed taught me what women are capable of creating when they support each other, when they share knowledge, when they transform their pain into purpose, their anger into action, their fear into courage. And that, my dear viewers, is perhaps the most important lesson I can share with you today. The years passed like the waters of the river that cuts through our lands, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, but always flowing forward. That encounter with Tim had been the last chapter of a story I thought would never end. After him, we never had direct news of Jerome or Jesse again. It was as if our lives had finally been freed from the chains of the past. Peter married the teacher's daughter, as everyone expected. A simple ceremony in the small community chapel, followed by a celebration in our house yard, with music, food, and dancing until dawn. It was the first time in many years that I saw Mom dance, laughing like a girl, her eyes shining with a joy I thought she would never feel again. 2 years after that wedding, in 1975, John achieved what he had dreamed so much: a place in the town school with housing and food provided. He had gotten a scholarship through an Italian priest who passed through the region, was impressed with his intelligence, and recommended him for an educational program. It was difficult to see him leave, but we knew it was best for him, that he deserved that opportunity to escape the harshness of the desert. So it was just Mom and me in the farmhouse, 2 women who had survived the worst life could offer, who carried a heavy secret, but who now, finally, could breathe without fear. We continued working the land, taking care of the small chicken and goat farm, living simply but with dignity. My work with the women of the community continued to grow, to expand, to touch more and more lives. It was no longer just an informal group that met to talk and learn. We had organized, created an association that defended the rights of women in the region, that offered shelter for those who needed to escape violence, that taught trades that allowed financial independence. "I never thought I would see this in my lifetime," Mom would say, watching a group of women gathered in our house, openly discussing issues that, years before, would be unthinkable to mention in public. I was 30 then, and, against all expectations for a single woman from the countryside at that time, I had become a kind of leader, a reference. People sought me out not just for advice or help, but to resolve conflicts, to mediate difficult situations, to speak on behalf of those who had no voice. My dear viewers who are still with me, can you imagine the transformation? From a terrified, abused, silenced girl to a strong, respected woman, capable of making a difference in the lives of others? It's a journey that still amazes me when I look back. Leave in the comments which city you're watching from. Your support, your comments warm the heart of this old woman who still marvels at the paths life takes us on. It was during this period that life brought us another unexpected turn. John, who had been studying in the city for almost 3 years, returned for a visit bringing surprising news. He had gotten a job in a large store in the capital, Phoenix, and wanted us to live with him. "In the city?" asked Mom, incredulous. "Leave the farm? Everything we know?" "Yes, Mom," he insisted, excited. "Life is different there. There are opportunities we would never have here. Mary could continue her studies, maybe even go to college." The idea seemed absurd. Me, at 30, going back to school, going to university like an 18-year-old? And Mom, leaving the land where she had lived her entire life, where she had buried not only my father, but also the ghosts that had haunted us for so long. But the seed had been planted. In the weeks following John's departure, the idea grew, took shape, became a real possibility. Life on the farm was getting increasingly difficult. The drought had been punishing the region for years. The harvests were increasingly meager. The future seemed uncertain. "And our work here?" I asked Mom one night as we discussed John's proposal. "The women, the association, everything we built?" She looked at me with that wisdom that only years and suffering can give. "The work that began here can continue in other places," she said simply. "The seed has been planted. Others will continue what you started," and they had continued, really. Mary Beth, that young woman who used to be beaten by her husband, had become a leader in her own community. Teresa Johnson, who everyone thought would never recover after her husband abandoned her with 5 small children, now taught other women to make embroidery they sold to stores in the city. So many stories of transformation, of women who had found their voice, their strength. After months of hesitation, of doubts, of planning, we finally made our decision. We would sell the small property, the animals, almost everything we owned, and go to Phoenix. It was a leap into the dark, a huge risk, but also an opportunity to truly start over, to leave behind not just the place, but the memories, the weight of the past. The farewell was difficult. The women I had worked with for years, the families we had known forever, the land that had been the silent witness of so many moments, both the terrible and the joyful ones. On our last day on the farm, I went alone to that distant piece of land where, years before, we had buried our tormentors, our secret, part of our souls. The place was unrecognizable now. Nature had reclaimed its domain, covering everything with dense vegetation, erasing any trace of what had happened there. I stayed a while in silence, letting the memories come, the pain, the fear, but also the sense of liberation, of brutal justice that had followed. "Rest in peace," I whispered, not knowing exactly if I was speaking to the dead or to myself. Rest in peace. Phoenix was another world compared to our desert. Tall buildings, busy streets, cars, buses, people of all types, accents, colors. In the first months, Mom and I felt completely lost, disoriented by so much novelty, so much noise, so much agitation. We lived in a small apartment in the downtown area, not far from the store where John worked. It was a cramped space, without the large yard we were used to, without the silence of the night in the countryside, without the starry sky that had always covered us. But it had running water, electricity, a bathroom inside the house, luxuries we had never known. Little by little, like plants transplanted to a new soil, we adapted, created roots in this different environment. Mom found a job as a cook in a boarding house where her knowledge of homestyle cooking from the Southwest was valued. I got a job as an assistant in a daycare, taking care of children whose mothers needed to work. And, more surprisingly still, I followed John's advice and went back to study. First, the GED, to complete the basic education that had been interrupted so many years before. Then, encouraged by teachers who saw in me an uncommon determination, I began to prepare for college entrance exams. Psychology, I answered, when they asked me what course I intended to take. I want to understand the human mind, how people deal with trauma, how we overcome the worst experiences. It was an ambitious dream, almost impossible for a woman of my age, with my background, my origin. But I had learned in the hardest way that life is made of impossibles that become reality, both the terrible and the wonderful ones. In 1980, at 34, against all odds, I entered Arizona State University in the psychology program. I was by far the oldest student in the class. Most of my colleagues could be my children if I had followed the normal path for a woman of my generation and region. "It's never too late to start over," said the developmental psychology professor when she saw me discouraged in front of the mountain of content to absorb, the difficulties of keeping up with the pace of the younger ones, the constant feeling of not really belonging to that academic world. In my second year of college, Mom got sick. At first, it seemed just a strong flu, those common in the humid winter of Phoenix, so different from the dry climate of the desert we were used to. But it got worse, turning into a severe pneumonia that hospitalization and antibiotics couldn't control. "Don't worry, my daughter," she said, holding my hand in the hospital, her voice weak but still carrying that courage I always admired. "I've lived longer than I expected. I've seen you and your brothers on their way in life. I've seen you find your purpose, your strength." "Don't talk like that, Mom," I begged, feeling the tears I couldn't control. "You still have a lot of life ahead, a lot to see, to live." She just smiled, that serene smile she had learned to show even in the most difficult moments. Deep down, we both knew the truth. Her body, tired from so many battles, from so much hard work, from so much suffering, was reaching its limit. On a rainy night in July, with the sound of drops hitting against the hospital window, Mom departed. Gently, without drama, without apparent suffering. I held her hand until the last moment, as she had held mine so many times throughout life, protecting me, strengthening me, teaching me to survive in a world that seemed determined to destroy us. The funeral was simple, as she would have wanted. Peter came with his wife and 2 small children. John was there with his fiancée, a city girl Mom never got to meet. Some neighbors from the boarding house where she worked, some college classmates of mine, John's friends. A small group, but sincere in their grief for a woman whose true story, whose real strength, few really knew. We buried Mom in a cemetery on the outskirts of Phoenix, far from the land where she was born, grew up, suffered, survived. As I watched the coffin descend into the earth, I thought of the other grave, that distant night, of another burial that had been so different from this one, but which was connected to it by invisible lines of cause and effect, of desperate choices, of consequences that extended through the years. "Now it's just you who knows," said John on the way back, when we were alone on the bus. "Only you who carries the whole story." I looked at him, surprised. "What story?" "Mom never told," he answered, looking out the window at the gray city under the rain. "But I saw things, heard things. I was a child, but I wasn't stupid. I know something happened that night. I know you did what you had to do." I felt a chill run down my spine. After so long, after so much care to preserve the secret, to protect my brothers from that terrible truth, he knew. Maybe not all the details, but enough. "John, you don't need to say anything," he interrupted me, finally looking me in the eyes. "I never needed to know exactly what happened. I know you had no choice. I know you did what you did to protect us, to survive. I never judged, never questioned." The tears returned with force, blurring my vision. They weren't tears just of pain for the recent loss, but of relief, of a weight being partially lifted after so many years. "Does Peter know?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. "I think he suspects, but we never talked about it. Some truths are too heavy to share, even between brothers." I nodded, grateful for the wisdom of that young man who, when everything happened, was just a child. Grateful for his silence, for his understanding, for his love that transcended judgments. The following months were an exercise in reconstruction, in moving forward even when it seemed impossible. I continued in college, despite the pain, despite the difficulty of reconciling studies and work. Now that I no longer had Mom's financial help, the nights were the worst, alone in the small apartment that now seemed too big, without the comforting presence that had always been my safe harbor. It was during this period that I began to write. Not exactly a diary, but a record of our story, of our struggles, of our victories and defeats. Not for publication, not for others to read, but for myself, to organize my thoughts, to understand the path I had traveled, to honor Mom's memory. Writing heals, my clinical psychology professor would say. Transforming experiences into words is a way of making sense of chaos, of integrating trauma into our life narrative without allowing it to completely define us. And she was right. Page after page, night after night, I was unearthing memories, feelings, reflections I had kept buried for so many years. The process was painful, sometimes left me exhausted, unable to sleep after reliving such intense moments. But it was also liberating, clarifying, healing in a way I had never experienced before. I graduated in psychology in 1985, at 39 years old. John was there, proud as if he himself were receiving the diploma. Peter couldn't come. His wife was in the last days of pregnancy with their third child. But he sent a congratulatory telegram that I keep to this day. It was a moment of triumph, of achieving a dream I didn't even know I had until a few years before. I began working in a community clinic, serving low-income people who normally wouldn't have access to psychological treatment. I specialized in trauma, in domestic violence, in helping women and children who had gone through experiences similar to mine. It wasn't easy work. Each story I heard echoed with my own memories, reopened scars that never completely closed. But it was the right work for me. For each woman, I managed to help find her voice, her strength, her ability to rebuild life after devastating experiences. I felt I was honoring Mom's legacy, the journey we had traveled together. In the years that followed, I continued my clinical work, but also went back to study. I did specialization, master's degree, published articles about trauma and resilience that were, in part, disguised reflections about my own experience. I became a reference in my field, invited to give lectures, to train new professionals, to help develop public policies aimed at protecting women and children. In 1994, an unexpected event brought the past back, but in a way I could never have predicted. I was giving a lecture at a conference in Tucson when, in the question session, an elderly man stood up in the back of the room. "Professor Mary," he said, his voice trembling with age, but still recognizable. "I don't know if you remember me. Tim, from Prescott." I felt the world stop for a moment. There he was, almost unrecognizable. More than 30 years had passed since our last meeting. An old man now, white hair, face marked by time, leaning on a cane that was no longer improvised, but still necessary. After the lecture, we met at the hotel cafe. The conversation was strange, uncomfortable at first, but gradually transformed into something closer to a dialogue between old acquaintances, united by a complex and painful past. He had continued his work as a midwife in West Texas, had helped found a birth center that was now a reference in the region. He had married a local teacher, had 2 adopted children, several grandchildren. A common, normal life, built on the ruins of a past that was far from common or normal. "I never forgot," he said, looking at the coffee cup in his wrinkled hands. "I never forgot what I did, what we did. That night at the wake after, I never forgot." "Neither did I replied honestly. "But it seems we both chose the same path afterwards, didn't we?" he continued, now looking me in the eyes. "Trying to fix what was broken. Not in ourselves. Some things have no repair, but in the world around us. Trying to do some good to compensate for the evil we did or suffered." There was a deep truth in his words, an understanding that could only come from someone who had walked similar roads, even if from opposite positions. We said goodbye after a few hours, knowing we would probably never see each other again. We weren't friends. We could never be after everything. But we also weren't enemies anymore. We were survivors of a shared story, witnesses to a past that had shaped who we became, for better and for worse. When I returned to Phoenix after this unexpected meeting, I felt a strange sense of closure, as if a cycle that began on that terrible night of my father's wake had finally completed itself. It didn't mean the scars had disappeared, that the memories didn't hurt anymore, that the weight of what we had done had been lifted, but it meant I had found a way to live with that weight, to integrate that story into my identity without allowing it to completely define me. The years continued to pass. Peter lost his wife to cancer, but found comfort in his children and grandchildren. John built a successful career in Phoenix, now owner of the store where he was once just a young employee. I continued my clinical, academic, and social work, touching more and more lives, expanding the limits of what I thought possible to do. At 60, I decided to return to Prescott, not to the farm. That place no longer existed, had been swallowed by the advance of the city, transformed into a residential neighborhood where no one knew or remembered the story that had happened there decades before. But to the city itself, to its familiar streets, its mild climate, its pace of life that matched my now diminished energy. I bought a little house near the central square, opened a small craft shop that became more of a meeting point than a business itself. The women of the region, daughters and granddaughters of those I worked with so many years before, brought their embroidery, their lace, their works to sell. And in the process, they also brought their stories, their joys and concerns, their struggles and victories. Things had changed since my youth. Women now spoke more openly about their experiences, had more resources, more options, more support. Violence hadn't disappeared. It will never completely disappear as long as we live in a society that still carries so many traces of patriarchy, of inequality. But there was more hope, more possibilities for escape, for resistance, for transformation. And now, at 79, sitting in this rocking chair on the porch of my shop, looking at the square where children play and young people court, I share my story with you. Not the whole story. Some details are too heavy to be said out loud. Some secrets go with me to the grave, but enough for you to understand the journey, the path from ashes to stars that I traveled throughout a life that began in pain, but found purpose, meaning, even joy. My dear viewers, before ending this story, I want to ask once more. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and especially comment below where you're watching from. Each story shared is a hand extended to someone who might be going through the same thing right now, feeling as alone as I felt in that bedroom so many years ago. Life is made of choices, some impossible, some terrible, some liberating. The important thing is not never falling, never failing, never crossing boundaries we believed uncrossable. The important thing is what we do afterwards, how we rebuild, how we transform ashes into something new, something beautiful, something meaningful. From the ashes of my past, from the ashes of what I was and what was done to me, I managed to find my way to the stars. Those that shine in the night sky of Prescott, but also those that shine within us when we find our purpose, our strength, our ability to transform pain into healing, trauma into wisdom, despair into hope. And this journey, my dear viewers, is the true revenge. Not the one we planned on a dark night, driven by desperation and anger, but the one we build day after day, year after year. The revenge of living well, of loving deeply, of helping others find their own way out of darkness. This is Mary Jo Sanders, Grandma Mary from the Square for you, saying goodbye with gratitude for having accompanied me this far, for having heard my story with such respect and affection. May God bless each one of you, and may you never lack the strength to transform your own ashes into stars.